Hello, everyone. Welcome to Canadian Race Relations Foundation's webinar. We will be starting shortly. Thank you for joining us. Hello, everyone. I'm Alicia Damley with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. We will be starting our webinar shortly. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. I hope you can all hear me. Welcome to Canadian Race Relations Foundation's webinar to mark August 23rd, International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition. Please note, this webinar is being recorded. Bonjour et bonne journée. Bienvenue au webinaire de la Fondation canadienne des relations raciales. Veuillez noter que ce webinaire est en cours d'enregistrement. Je suis Alicia Damley, membre du conseil d'administration de CRRF et actuellement directrice générale intérimaire, alors que l'organisation termine sa recherche de nouveaux dirigeants. I'm Alicia Damley, member of CRRF's board and currently interim executive director as the organization completes its search for new leadership. I'm joined by my colleagues, Suveka Priyatharsan, Manager, Programs and Information Management, who will guide us through the Q&A, and Sharon Pun, CRRF's Research, Resource, and Records Librarian. Both have been indispensable in my tenure to date. CRRF was created by an Act of Parliament proclaimed in 1996 as part of the Japanese-Canadian Redress Agreement. We are Canada's leading agency dedicated to the elimination of racism and of all forms of racial discrimination in Canadian society. The values which guide our work are collaboration, fairness and justice, humility, human rights, respect, and transparency. The night of the 22nd and 23rd of August 1791, in Saint-Domingue, the wealthiest colony in the French Empire, marked the launch of the uprising of men and women revolting against and eventually paving the way for the end of slavery and dehumanization. Their long battle ended in late 1803, culminating in the creation of the new nation of Haiti on January 1st, 1804. UNESCO named August 23rd International Day to honor their remarkable efforts and in their memory. We know today there can be no justification for trade in fellow human beings. Let us take a moment to look back at this human cost. The slave trade began out of Africa in 1500, continuing for 4 centuries with the overwhelming numbers taken to the Americas. In the 15th and 16th centuries, more than 1.3 million people were sold to be deported. By the 17th century, these numbers had more than tripled. And in the 18th century, they had doubled again. The 19th century saw a modest decline, due in part to the passing of abolition of the Slave Trade Acts in Britain, its colonies, including the United States, and parts of Europe. But this was not before 18 million African people had been enslaved. The centuries-long horrific backdrop continues to haunt us in numerous ways, most notably in the continuing devastating impact on people of African descent. Here in Canada, we are not immune. These events have manifested themselves in the systemic racism experienced by Black Canadians. There is no shortage of objective data supporting this irrefutable conclusion. Our discussion today is intent on dialogue to discuss and, importantly, lead us forward to review current day implications, but also identifying recommendations to reverse these outcomes. Speaking to this are Chiamaka Mọgọ, my CRRF board colleague and a public policy consultant. Chiamaka's path since her teens has been one in mobilizing stakeholders, implementing action plans, and managing projects that promote equity, inclusion, and development in Canada and sub-Saharan Africa. A recipient of several awards recognizing her commitment to fostering resilient societies, she holds degrees in public administration and public policy from the Universities of Ottawa and British Columbia. Joining Chiamaka is Natasha Henry, an educator, historian, and curriculum consultant. Natasha is president of the Ontario Black History Society, an Ontario heritage organization, and is completing a PhD in history at York University, researching the enslavement of Africans in early Ontario. Through her various roles, Natasha's work is grounded in her commitment to research, collect, preserve, and disseminate the histories of Black Canadians. Before I hand over, please know that your participation is welcome. We have set aside time for a Q&A at the end of this conversation, so please enter your questions into the Q&A box. With the panelists, Suveka will help address as many as time permits. For the best webinar experience for everyone, we ask listeners to please keep your line on mute. With that, let me hand over to Chiamaka and Natasha.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. I wanted to thank the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, Alicia, Suveka, and others who were able to come together to help make this event happen. And I wanted to thank Alicia for that great introduction to the history of today, which is the 22nd UNESCO's International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition, which is also called the Slavery Remembrance Day. It's an opportunity to reflect on the transatlantic slave trade and how it has and continues to have a profound impact on the lived realities of African descendant people. It's also an opportunity to honor our African ancestors who were enslaved in the Atlantic world, including here in Canada, and to encourage us to learn more about their stories, those who were held in bondage. I wanted to open up by saying that it's a common African-centered custom to begin an event paying homage to the ancestors through either libations and or the recitations of their names. And so I just wanted to take a moment to honor and remember a few of the Black men, women, and children who were held in hereditary bondage in the Atlantic world, both known and unknown. Taki, Sam Sharp, Zumba, Brefu, Usa, Mary Thomas, also known as Queen Mary, Jemmy, Marie-Joseph Angelique, Beth, Amelia and Jack Bayers, Jane, Kofi, Thursday, Abraham, Juba, Tom, Peggy, Scipio, Negro wench, Negro boy, Negro girl, Negro. Let us remember our ancestors, those ancestors who fought relentlessly for freedom, for justice, and for humanity. And remember that they endured unspeakable conditions in the Middle Passage, and that they lived under conditions of oppression, but yet they lived. And I just wanted to close my opening by saying that it's important for us to remember that we are because they were. And so I encourage you to think about, as we look at the connections between the past and the present, and this history of enslavement, I encourage you to think deeper about how the processes that displaced and forcibly removed millions of indigenous Africans from their lands to exploit their labor in the imperial endeavors to create a new world are interconnected to the dispossession of indigenous peoples on these lands, settler colonialism, and how African peoples who were enslaved in the New World, including here in Canada, were stolen people on stolen land. And so I hope that you will enjoy the conversation today, and that after today, I encourage you to continue your learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for that great intro. As you said, in African tradition, to recognize the ancestors and also thank them and tap into their resilience.
Yes.
I thank my colleague on the Race Relations Board, Alicia Damey, for the great intro, and also for working hand in hand with the CRRF team to organize this meeting today. And I want to also add on to the acknowledgement that Natasha has done, in the sense that, you know, just like you said, we are acknowledging ancestors, those ones that were even recorded and the ones that were recorded. Mm-hmm. And we acknowledge some who didn't even survive to have descendants. Mm-hmm. I'm of the story of Igbo landing, Igbo IGBO. It's a tribe in present-day Nigeria. And they were Africans who were transported as enslaved Africans to where is now known as Georgia. They were bought by slave owners. After being bought by slave owners, the intention was to resell them to other slave owners in Georgia. Now, these Igbo slaves, when they were being transported for reselling, these enslaved Africans, enslaved Igbo people, when they were being retransported to be sold again, they decided amongst themselves that a life in bondage was not what they would want. That, of course, that's not what anybody would want, but they chose that they would prefer death than to live a life in bondage. So the story goes that they took over the ship, they disempowered their captors and people who were driving the ship, they grounded the ship, and because their traditional leader was among them, they marched gradually into the river, somewhere in what is now St. Simon's Island in Georgia. They marched gradually to commit suicide because they felt that it was better for them to die than to live in bondage, to live the rest of their lives in bondage. This is not their reality, and this is not what they wanted to do. So the story also goes that not all of them died in the suicide attempt, but there's a bigger story there that's about, or there's a big lesson there that's about self-determination and how slavery robbed Africans of that very ideal of self-determination. Self-determination is something that was not just crucial for these Igbo people, it's crucial for many African communities around the continent. And the very aspect of slavery robbed them of their self-determination, of their human dignity. And so when we continue to see racism as it plays out in our communities today, in Canada today, wherever in North America, it reminds us that we're robbing people of their dignity, but also robbing them of their self-determination, which should come naturally to any person. So hopefully this discussion inspires more thought and hopefully more questions around what can we do better to end the legacy of slavery, because it's been about time a long time ago. So hopefully we can have some more catalyze more dialogue today. So that being said, Natasha, maybe we can go on to talk about what the legacy of slavery is in present day Canadian society.
Yes, and it's nice to meet you, Chiamaka. And some of the things when we look at the legacies of the institution of enslavement of African peoples and how that had manifested in Canada, we can see that in so many ways. We see it in what we now commonly call anti-Black racism, systemic racism that is quite nuanced in terms of its impact, its effect, and its targeting of people of African descent, and how systems and institutions in in Western world and on this side of the Atlantic, how they were structured as they were structured with disadvantaging African people and exploiting their labor in many senses, and I'll get back to that, and also the systemic exclusion of African peoples from institutions or from businesses, and these were all upheld by laws and policies and practices. And so we see that very much playing out today. As it relates to employment, we see with the employment statistics for people of African descent, where we have, for example, a large amount of Black Canadians who have post-secondary degrees, but yet it does not translate into income and employment outcomes for them. We see that people of African descent are heavily concentrated in particular job areas. And as we continue our discussion and make a connection to COVID, we'll talk a bit about that. We see that Black youth have the highest level of underemployment in Canada. And so we see that plays out there. And then as it relates to education, the experiences and the achievement outcomes for Black children in Canadian public schooling, again, we see a lot of disproportionate outcomes and experiences as it relates to them. So we see this, and again, as I said, in many different areas. There's been a lot of studies more recently that bear this out, and that they're not new information per se, but it's just an update. For some people that may be newer, we see it as well with health outcomes. A recent report from the Ontario Human Rights Commission and the Toronto Police, and their interactions and the disproportionate interactions that they are having. So these are some things, some ways that we see the legacies, or what Dr. Saidiya Hartman likes to call the afterlife of slavery.
That's a really great way to put it, the afterlife of slavery. It is true. And like you said, I just concord everything you said in terms of when we look at poor health outcomes for Black people in Canada, lack of trust with law enforcement, and I wanted to read a statistic here from the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Now, in 2018, November 2018, they released a report titled "A Collective Impact," and I quote, "Between 2013 and 2017, a Black person in Toronto was nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by the Toronto Police Service." This was released November 2018 by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And they also let us know that Black people just compose about 8.8% of Toronto's population, yet they're 20 more times likely to have a fatal interaction with the police than a white person. Now, fast forward to a few weeks later, so a year and a half after that report, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has released a new report titled "A Disparate Impact." And I will quote a simple quote from there: "Black people are more likely to be struck, shot, or killed by the Toronto police." I think this is a continued legacy of slavery in its manifestation of racism, as it occurs in of course in this case is police brutality, but it shows that in a year and a half there has been no significant change. So I looked at these statistics and I was like, wow, like are we going forward or are we going backward? Was the constant question. When you look at lack of access to jobs or good and safe jobs for Black people, including immigrants, lack of access to social protections, lack of access to safe and good housing, lack of poor representation of Black people in academia. When I was in university, I have my first degree and my master's degree, but when I was in university, I think cumulatively, I've only had 2 Black professors before, not because there are not a lot of them, but because the system does not allow for this. And when we do have Black professors, what are the measures that are used to make sure that we're retaining them? What are the measures that are used to make sure that your academic institution is one that's free of racial bias, or one that recognizes bias and does work to change that? So all these things to me are legacies of slavery that have, of course, shown itself as racism, but it's again, just as we, Natasha, just going on to what she's saying, it's the afterlife. It's the afterlife of slavery. It is the afterlife, and it shows because we're seeing that in this COVID time. We're seeing the poor health outcomes for people of African descent, and it just shows that naturally when somebody is vulnerable of something, when a natural disaster comes or when an epidemic comes, somebody who's already vulnerable is furthermore, their vulnerability is increased, so to speak. So this is all just, it's very tough information to sometimes to chew on, actually.
Yes, and if I can just add 2 things to that. Another study, another document that illuminates the afterlife of slavery is the report of the working group by the UN based out of the International Decade for People of African Descent. And when they visited here in Canada, they went across the country to talk about and to record how things were, what were the conditions for African Canadian people. And so, what they were documenting, again, is not necessarily new, but it was put together as a way to encourage the government, federal government and provincial government to address these things. And so, they started off by looking at the desperate outcomes and the history of racism experienced by African Nova Scotians, right? Looking at their history coming with a history of enslavement, Black loyalists migrating, and what happened at Africville with the demolition of that community. So there's that. And then a second thing that I wanted to touch on as well, when we see the continuity of or the manifestation of racism today out of slavery, what upholds that are the ideas of Black people and red and African people, and how Black bodies are coded in certain ways as a way again to maintain a structure, a racial hierarchy, which we continue to see play out.
Mm-hmm. That is true. And in terms of what we've often heard now, going on to the effects of slavery, the legacy of slavery, and COVID-19, one
Mm.
thing I've often heard as something that passes around is that there are some conceptions that actually that Black people are seen as not easily feeling pain,
Yes.
or like, so you've heard it?
Oh yes, yes, yes.
Okay, right. So we see this in the health industry where, for example, in the U.S. has well documented how Black women are more at risk of dying during childbirth or even just when they're pregnant because our pain is like is not thought to be like that serious. Our pain is subdued even within the health sector. So often when I see these outcomes of COVID-19 and how it's disproportionately affecting Black people, I'm often curious about what the people who have been had this experience of COVID in this time, what has been their healthcare experience? Did they feel that their needs were attended to? Did they feel that their healthcare, their pain was of the urgency? These are things that I think of because we've heard so many times, and society has shown us many times that our pain is often seen as it's not that serious, or they can handle pain. There are all these myths. And just going through, as a member representing Vancouver, I'm very concerned. Well, I've always been very concerned about the socioeconomic outcomes for Black people in Vancouver because we make just 1% of the population, yet we're very absent, or there's lack of inclusion for us in the business sector, academia, public health sector. So now that COVID is happening, I'm seriously concerned about the health impacts on the Black community. Because as I said before, and as we've talked about, when people are vulnerable already, things like this increase their vulnerability. Toronto has gone on to publish some race-based data, and recently it was the Toronto Public Health, and you can see that in Toronto, again, even though we just make up 8.8% of the population, 8.8% of the population, Black people are disproportionately represented in the effects on having COVID vis-a-vis their population in Toronto and vis-a-vis every other racial groups in Toronto. So these are, I do think that a solution to this would be, of course, ending systemic racism, not just in government institutions, but also in health institutions, and also universal health care, so that people who they're within the population of Black people, we also have Black immigrants who would not qualify for health care if they don't have the health card or certain documentation that sometimes people are unaware of when they're new to Canada as well. So anyway, any thoughts on this?
Yes, and I agree with all of what you said. Right there are some key elements. Access to health care. You talked about the Toronto data, and it shows that there is a heavy concentration of COVID cases, and Black people disproportionately are represented in that data. And there's an overlay of where Black people live in the city, and they said that the northwest part of the city, we start to see how that plays out. We see that Black people are heavily represented in positions in jobs where they have greater exposure to COVID. A lot of Black women as personal support workers or nurses, so we see that there's another level of vulnerability, and so then you have that overlay of you said of socioeconomic, where people fit in these different categories. And so if we have these confines of employment, of where people live, where they're able to get housing because of their race, and their income. So all of these things contribute, and we see that in the data that has been reported on how COVID has impacted people. And as you talked about, these ideas again about Black health and Black pain and Black wellness that really are rooted in the history of slavery. The idea that Black women could, for example, bounce back after childbirth so quickly and be put back to work, or like you said, have a higher threshold for pain. all of these misconceptions are detrimental to Black life.
Right.
When we're talking about how do we address these things, it's acknowledging what these ideas are, what these practices are, and interrupting them really through, again, counter practices and policies that help to improve the conditions and lives of Black people.
Mm-hmm. And there's been so much documented. Something that I've always been curious about, like there's been so much documentation on, race relations, how to advance, public health vis-a-vis, vis-a-vis Black communities, how to advance, just how to eliminate racial discrimination in its totality. At the Race Relations Foundation, we have a clearinghouse. We have a clearinghouse of resources where researchers, everyday people, including from the Black community, have written lots of articles. The vast majority are free. So I'm always curious as to, we've done, so much work has been built across the world on eliminating racism, and especially anti-Black racism. Why? Who's listening? Because clearly, if we're seeing all these outcomes, society has not listened enough. Our institutions have not listened enough, where we're seeing all these cases of institutional systemic racism. And my thought, one thing I've always said is there needs to be more individual and institutional responsibility.
Mm.
There needs to be that. That is my thought on it, because I always think, I said, so much has been done. And usually sometimes people would say, we want you to teach us, want the Black person to teach us how to be better, how to learn better. And I think, well, it's fine, but there's been so much that has been done, and there's been so much teaching. So it's also on to you, to your institution, on to you as an individual, to actually take an inward look, check your implicit biases, reinvent institutions that are rooted on slavery and colonization, ideas of slavery and colonization. But I'm very interested to know your thoughts on, being that there's so much done, how can what do people need to start doing?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you touch on it a bit. Institutions, a lot of our institutions are colonial institutions, which are inherently racist, inherently constructed on white dominance. And so the question then becomes, how much or who has the power in order to change the way that institutions function? And then it gets us thinking about, how much people really want change to happen, because that will then mean flattening this hierarchy that plays out in our society in different ways. So there's that. And education is absolutely important, but education without action is not going to get us anywhere. So the action is absolutely very important as well. I think we're in a moment of a longer trajectory of a movement for racial justice and economic justice for Black and African people. And so I think here we are at a time where people want to become more educated and want to take action. And so it's about continuing that momentum. And it's about, I guess, envisioning something different and working towards that. But again, the dynamic of power is very important. And we see how, again, Black Canadians continue not to have access to certain opportunities, to certain venues that privileges other groups through their networks. And we only have to see that play out in different levels, whether federally or provincially. And so I don't know how much the people on the ground could really interrupt that, in as much as the people who have the power to make those changes.
That's a good one. So that's true. So I do think there's always that complex of the hierarchy, and what happens when we, what happens when we change what we're used to, what happens when we change the power balance. I think that's a very interesting one. I'm seeing notifications that we should check the questions, so let me just quickly see what we would, if there's anyone that could pop up. And we encourage everyone to please keep sending in their questions. Okay. Natasha, how do you want us to go about the Q&A? Do you want us to just choose? Would you want to go ahead or anyone?
Yeah, you can start by reading the question and then we can try to respond together. Sure.
All right, sure. Okay, so there's one from Shelly Papin, and the question goes, are we dealing with racism in real time? People want to talk about slavery and civil rights, etc., but what about the microaggressions that take place today? So I'll read it again. I can read it again. Are we dealing with racism in real time? People want to talk about slavery and civil rights, etc., but what about the microaggressions that take place today?
Well, I would say it's not an either or situation. It's both and. We can't understand where we are if we don't understand the past. We can't understand why is it that Black people experience particular individual-based microaggressions that are connected to a particular history. And so we have to be able to see that and make those connections. And so then there's the individual level, the interpersonal situations of racism and discrimination, but then there's also the systemic piece, the broader systemic piece in terms of how institutions act on people of African descent. So it's important for us to talk about it, to address all of them, not just one over or the other.
And I totally agree. I don't think it's either or because, slavery, the history of colonization, slavery, they're all playing out in our modern day society. And even when it comes to microaggressions, all these things are tied into our legacy, the legacy of slavery and colonization. So just like you said, it's not something that needs to be separated. We need to have the conversation about the histories. When we talk about our history, we learn for the present. That's usually how it works. And I think when it comes to microaggressions, we've heard about how Black people face this at work. Which is one of the things that goes back to when I was talking about, for example, Black people in academia, for example, and I was saying, how do we retain? When people talk about diversity generally, how do you retain your workforce? How do you retain your workforce that are part of, for example, the Black community? Because sometimes when we go into systems, we face racism, we face microaggressions. So these are important conversations to have. But again, all of them, this ties into the conversation about slavery and colonization and racism. So it's important for us to have these conversations, identify history's pain and the past and wrongdoings, and this would kind of catalyze action to hopefully change the present.
And when you mentioned that as well, a response from workplaces then should be policies and practices that seek to eradicate those experiences of microaggressions or racial discrimination in the workplace. And so it's important, as I said, to make those connections there.
And Natasha, I just want to confirm, are you still seeing my video? Because I'm reading the questions. So, okay, perfect. Okay, great. So let's go on to another one. Where do you see the possibility of restructuring the history curriculum to include a more significant amount of Black Canadian history? Where do you see the possibility of restructuring the history curriculum to include a more significant amount of Black Canadian history? The question is by Carlton Darby.
Okay, well, that's a great question. So a lot of the work that I do is as a curriculum consultant, developing resources and materials that capture the experiences of Black people in Canada, past and present, because there's a huge gap in the curriculum and in the provincial curricula across the country. The Ontario Black History Society was founded 42 years ago, because as parents and community members, the co-founders were concerned that their children were not learning about their history, their rich past, the African diaspora. And so for 42 years, this has been some of the work that the Ontario Black History Society has been doing through various means, our programs, exhibits, resources. We've been doing that, and we are pushing even more so this year to realize the development of a museum space. Because we need to have these spaces to document, to record, and to share our history. In the Ontario curriculum, there isn't one specific thing that all students in Ontario have to learn about a 400-year African presence here in this country. And Nova Scotia, their curriculum expectations are better and more explicit. So in terms of what can be done to improve that, it shouldn't just be incumbent upon individual teachers who see this as important in order to undertake the integration of Black history in their instruction. I would like to see more curriculum expectations across all provinces as a way to support everyone learning about Black Canadian history and the history of the African diaspora. And it's beneficial to Black children, absolutely, in terms of developing a strong sense of self, a positive sense of racial pride. But if we are here talking about disrupting racism, it's equally important for non-Black children, for non-Black people to learn about the history of different groups and the experiences that they've had in the past, so that they then become active agents in changing institutions as well.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's true. And I also look at my own post-secondary experience and not having learned about any Black figure in class. I had to go outside of the school system to learn about it. And I learned about it by virtue of being from the Black community, and of course my interest is somebody from the Black community. So as you say, Natasha, it's important for people who are also non-Black to have this information. It shouldn't be something that I had to learn about it because I was interested and because I was from that community, but school didn't give me that opportunity to do so. I think that's something clearly that does need to change. Another thing I would say is the structure of our curricula, where sometimes everything is so set. Everything is so set that, okay, you're going to write an essay on how Canada was formed and the government system of Canada. Or we always have essays that are questions set by teachers, where everything is just one way. There's no chance to disrupt. There's no chance to decolonize your curricula. I think that's something that needs to be improved. And when I was doing my master's degree, something that I was grateful for, that I didn't really have much in my first degree that I had in my master's degree, was my professors would say, write a topic, do research around this topic that, do a research on this topic that fits into the course, but you can do it on anywhere. So I would write articles. I would do research and write articles on Indigenous peoples in Canada. I'll do research from Asia. I'll do on Africa. For me, that was my own way of decolonizing my learning, and of course not following a pattern. But that was something that I felt that is something that if there's any educators on here, I would recommend, is to open your curricula. When you give students assignment, is that sometimes allow them to be creative, allow them to find stories about people that don't look like them, who may think differently from them, be a little bit more open. I think it also helps to diversify what people are learning.
Yes, and just as another point on curriculum, that curriculum is part of a state institution, also plays a role in maintaining the structures as well. And so, our efforts need to be to decolonize, like you said, in order to really question and disrupt those structures that support each other and are so entangled.
That's true.
And Natasha and Chiamaka, I'm just going to step in and read out some of the questions that will be a little bit easier for you. So one of the questions that came in was, where does anti-Black racism fit into the larger conversation around truth and reconciliation that is ongoing with Canada's Indigenous people?
Well, so briefly, as I mentioned earlier in my acknowledgement, of African ancestors. That it's important that we see and we are aware of the history of colonization, of the processes of colonization, and how they're very much interconnected. And so when I talked about how African people were stolen from the continent of Africa and brought to the New World, and their labor was stolen, in the lands of the indigenous people here were stolen as part of the empire building. And so you see how they're interconnected. So there's somewhat of a parallel history coming out of this history of European colonization. And then there are very distinct experiences as well because of that. And so the struggle, the fight for liberation and full justice for African people is also tied to indigenous sovereignty here. And so it's important to not polarize this history, but to see how interconnected they are and how complex they are. That is something that will help us to work through what it is that we see today. Anytime, and we see that bearing out in, again, the statistical outcomes. Whenever we talk about racially disaggregated data, it's always indigenous and Black people who are disproportionately impacted or affected or represented in these statistics. And so we can see that, again, connected to these particular histories.
Thank you, Natasha. Another question that came in was, for Black Indigenous people of color, we face ongoing discrimination and racism, and individual communities are standing up. What are the ways you see for communities coming together so we are a powerful force to fight racism? For example, Japanese Canadians are using their experience of injustice to speak out and to amplify messages for Indigenous peoples and Black Lives Matter. What else can we do?
That's a great question. Definitely has a lot of a huge link to some of the things that Natasha and I have talked about. And in terms of Black people organizing together, is something that has Black people organizing, mobilizing for change. It's something that has happened for a long time. We've also even had NGOs, we've had organizations who have continued to push that agenda of mobilizing and representing the common person, and the common person being a mediator between the common person and higher levels of authority in society, whether it's the police, whether it's government. That has been something that's been going on for a long time. Indigenous communities have also been doing that as well. And with the Black Lives Matter movement, especially in this latest one that was unfortunately inspired by the murder of Judge Floyd, we saw this huge solidarity between Black people and different ethnic communities, including Indigenous peoples. I think it's the idea that we do share a common path of being passionate about a struggle for freedom and true freedom. So in terms of the Black community and Indigenous communities, I do think that collaboration, that solidarity has happened, and even individual communities, the Black and Indigenous communities individually working and striving to have justice. One thing that I do think society at the broader level has to do, as Natasha and I have talked about, is to take that institutional responsibility, and individuals actually having to take that responsibility outside of Black people or Indigenous people. We've built a lot of work. We've built on a lot. Society needs to now commit to changing, now commit to taking action, because there's so much that has been done. There's so much resources that our communities have built. It's now important for society to take that responsibility to say, enough is enough. And truly, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous lives matter, and it's time for society to change. And also, again, checking your implicit biases, making sure that when you want truth and reconciliation, you're really ready to reconcile. You're honestly ready to reconcile. You're not scared of losing that hierarchy that Natasha was greatly pointed out. There's a huge level of personal and institutional responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so I think other groups, non-Black groups who want to be activists and who are activists in agitating for change, it's important for people to understand again the particular history of Black people and coming out of this history of enslavement, in which we continue to deal with today, and not to to do things in a way that erases that history, and not to do things in a way where we're equating all groups as being the same. So, sometimes you will hear, well, this particular group, they were immigrants and they did this and this and that, and they followed this path and they have these outcomes. So Black people should follow this similar model. That really is counterproductive to affecting change. And so looking at Black experiences for what they are, listening to what Black people say needs to be changed, and there are a range of opinions, and finding where it is you feel that you can have an impact in your particular sphere of your influence, which will differ for everyone. But I think the more people that can amplify the issues and the concerns and play hands-on on pushing for change and implementing change, the further that we will be.
Thank you. And I think a possible question that goes along with what you were just talking about is, are we dealing with racism in real time? People want to talk about slavery and civil rights, etc. But what about the microaggressions that are taking place in society today?
Well, I think Chiamaka and that question already.
Oh, I apologize. Okay. let me look at the next question that we have in here.
Yes, we actually addressed that already.
Okay. But another question that we got was, this particular individual would be interested to know about the rates of involvement with children's aid societies in Canada.
So there was a huge study done in the province of Ontario a few years ago, and that data bore out that even though Black people make up about just over 8% of the population, that Black children represented, I think it was 42% of children in care in the system. And there were efforts to help remedy that through, the approaches that the child welfare system was taking, who were in the leadership, who was in some of these jobs, and how they could better support families in need as opposed to criminalizing and removing children. And again, Indigenous people also have extremely high rates as well as it relates to the child welfare system. And so these statistics seem to be common across a lot of the major institutions in our society. Here in Ontario, the graduation rate or the dropout rate, the push-out rate, some would say, a few years ago was about equal to that, about 40% of Black youth. And so these numbers are alarming and really calls for a different way of doing things and a different way of institutions interacting and better supporting Black families in addressing racism.
I have nothing to add to that. I think Natasha has really perfectly sealed that. And I also want to add that it looks like we're wrapping up the Q&A right now. So we've come to the end of the Q&A. I do have a notification about the timing. So I wanted to say, Natasha, would you want to end this segment with telling people how they can keep in touch with your work? And I'll also share mine as well. And is that something you're interested in? Social media, website, anything like that?
Yeah, so I shared in the chat the website and the social media links for the Ontario Black History Society, to learn more about what we do, to learn more about our programs, and we share information regularly regarding Black history, Black experiences, and things that are impacting Black people. We are also underway of encouraging more membership and donations to support our goal to realize a Black History Museum. I'm also on social media as well. And I, again, personally share, that's one of the venues that I use to share a lot of important information as well. I have a website, and I'll put the link in here as well, where I've compiled resources around Black Canadian history that people who are interested in learning or teaching about it can draw on. And my current research on slavery, the history of slavery in early Ontario, is something that's ongoing, and I share a bit of that as I go along in my research and writing.
Oh, that's perfect. Thanks. Perfect. And it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, Natasha. It's been a great experience, and I'm grateful to the CRRF team that put this talk together.
Yes.
And for me, my name is, as people would see on the PowerPoint slide, my name is Chiamaka and Mọgọ. I had some technical difficulties logging in, so my mother graciously gave me her identity, Felicia Mọgọ. So that's the name Chiamaka and Mọgọ. You can find me on social media. And pretty much every other channel, Chiamaka and Mọgọ. And I've been a board member with the Race Relations Foundation since November 2018. And I am a policy analyst by training, passionate about building resilient communities, and I hope to continue to do that with the Race Relations Foundation. It's on the Race Relations Foundation. I think I've mentioned that before. I represent Vancouver. So if you ever need to, if there's anybody from Vancouver listening in, if there's anything that within the line of our mission or mandate that you would need to learn about or you want to discuss with the CRRF, please send an email to our foundation's email, which is on our website, www.crrf.ca, and reach out. And from there, we'd be able to reach out to me. And it's been an absolute pleasure having the discussion. I hope to connect with you on social media. I'm very active on Twitter. Again, Chiamaka Mọgọ is my name pretty much everywhere. And I hope that this conversation has inspired people that it's time for action. I know that many people joined this webinar not only to learn but to contribute, as we've seen through your questions. And we know we couldn't take all the questions because it's such a short period of time for a very important topic. But we hope to continue the conversation with you. And please follow the work of the Ontario Black History Society, the work of the Canadian Race Relations, and the work of Natasha and myself. Thank you for joining in.
Thank you, Natasha and Chiamaka. On behalf of CRRF, I would like to thank them for an informative conversation, acknowledging the past and its impact on Black Canadians in particular, but importantly, to guide this dialogue towards a successful path forward. This is an important ingredient to effect change, positive change, which makes a meaningful difference in the lives of Black Canadians and on Canadian society. We hope that all of you who took the time to join us found today's conversation helpful, to take something back to your community and to inform your activities to help make that change. Under a new board with a new strategic plan and a soon-to-be appointed new executive director, CRRF is similarly in the midst of relevant, constructive change. If you don't already, please visit our website to keep abreast of our upcoming changes and sign up for our newsletter. In the August edition, which is due out next week, you will find informative and relevant reading on the second interim report on the Ontario Human Rights Commission on racial profiling and discriminatory practices of the Toronto Police. Natasha alluded to this in her earlier comments, as did Chiamaka, as well as a review of hate crime statistics in Canada. We hope you will accompany us on CRRF's renewed and revitalized journey forward towards eliminating racism and all forms of racial discrimination in Canadian society. Thank you for sharing your Saturday afternoon or morning with us, and we look forward to meeting again at another CRRF event. Have a great rest of your weekend.